For over 36 months, Russia has waged war against Ukraine, and today we examine the military situation there. I'm Julian Rupka, and you are watching BILD Situation Room. And we start with footage that one wouldn't anticipate from a 21st century conflict, particularly when involving the army claimed to be the second strongest in the world. We begin with scenes featuring horses and donkeys. These different animals are currently being utilized by the Russian army in the eastern region of Ukraine, as in some instances, they find themselves with no vehicles available anymore at all, because they don't have armored vehicles anymore, and even the regular vehicles like loaders and similar ones simply aren't off-road capable enough for this environment here. The Russian army has therefore started to literally transition back to using horses and donkeys, and we can observe that they are being utilized to carry weapons and ammunition, as well as to transport food supplies to the front lines and then back again. These truly are exceptionally unique images, which after 3 years of war also, here's another bazooka hanging there that one simply wouldn't have expected these recordings after over 3 years of war. However, that is the condition of the Russian army as of 2025. We can see here how donkeys are accommodated in Russian positions, including in the bunkers, naturally protected by nets, of course, because these donkeys are now practically the alternative to vehicles. They need to be just as protected, just as shielded from Ukrainian artillery and drone attacks. And accordingly, these donkeys are now a precious commodity. Here's another shot, which I also find pretty insane. This donkey is presumably carrying 4 large 122mm caliber mortars that belong to the Russian army, and is currently in the process of transporting them to their designated position from where they are going to be fired. And the fact that the whole scenario isn't just made for PR shots becomes clear from these equally, well, in some way, yes, tragic and poignant images captured by a Ukrainian surveillance drone, because we can clearly see a Russian soldier positioned right here who is quite obviously leading a donkey. Makes an attempt to lead. Nevertheless, the donkey behaves as donkeys oftentimes do and stubbornly resists being used as an impromptu transport means, thereby thwarting the Russian army's efforts to move further into the eastern regions of Ukraine. As I said, these are very unique images, in my opinion, especially in the third year of the war, and especially when you repeatedly see Russia's claims that this is a modern war. A clean war, a high-tech war led by Russia, that's the reality. By now, people are relying on donkeys and horses in eastern Ukraine. And one of the places where these donkeys are now being used is around Pokrovsk, the Ukrainian city with 65,000 inhabitants, which is defended so effectively by Ukraine that the Russians frequently find themselves without any vehicles near the front lines and have to resort to using animals instead. We're examining new video footage that illustrates how Ukraine is not merely defending the front lines but is actively engaging in successful counterattacks, having already managed to regain control over the third village in the area. We see footage from the small village of Kotlin. We see how preparations are made, how Ukrainian kamikaze drones attack the Russian soldiers who have entrenched themselves in Kotlin. Following the substantial drone strikes carried out by Ukrainian drones targeting various buildings, we now observe the Ukrainian units launching their well-coordinated counterattack in this area after having decimated or at the very least wounded or shocked the Russian forces with the actions that have been carried out here. We are now observing different shots here. It's just 2 Humvees becoming clearly visible as time progresses. So it's not about large-scale arsenals that Ukraine has at its disposal, but rather in this situation it's 2 Humvees from a specialized military unit being actively deployed here, who are now just driving in there, firing at the Russians from close range, and then, and this is the special part because it's simply critical at this point, they leave their troops on the ground. It doesn't necessarily have to be the same unit. It could be other troops that are deployed there again to secure and hold that small place, Kotlin, once more under Ukrainian control. We'll take a look at it on the map shortly and find out why Kotlin is extremely important. In fact, it's the westernmost area beyond Pokrovsk, which had already been taken over by the Russian army, at least during some interval. For about 3 weeks, the Russians had control here. Now the Ukrainians have struck back. We observe that after completing a successful mission, the 2 vehicles that were deployed for this operation are now steadily making their way back to their base. As mentioned, the situation at Pokrovsk is one that the Russians cannot be pleased with because not only are they not advancing towards the city, but they have now lost the third location. Next to Lysivka, here next to Dachanska, besides Peshane and now also Kotlina, where we see these blue spots where we can see that the Russians, although they wanted to move further towards Pokrovsk exactly there, as I said, there's the city that once had 65,000 residents, where they were pushed back and had to retreat from a total of 3 localities. And why Kotlin is so extremely important, we can observe on the overall map provided here. We can see the E50 up here, which is the highway and serves as the main supply road from Pokrovsk going towards the central regions of Ukraine, towards the bustling city of Dnipro and other areas. And we observe that the Russian forces, with only a few kilometers to spare, if we examine it up there, managed to get approximately within a distance of about 5 kilometers, 6 kilometers away from the E50 at most. And if the Russians had had fire control over this road or had even positioned their soldiers on it, it would basically have been like signing a death sentence for the town of Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk, because once again, from the highways to very, very small roads in the vicinity, they would have been forced to reorganize the logistics quite extensively to continue defending Pokrovsk effectively. Therefore, the Ukrainian army is deployed here. Yet, as we clearly observed, in the end, 2 Humvees proved to be enough. 2 Humvees, each carrying perhaps 10 soldiers altogether, proved to be sufficient to successfully reclaim Kotlin. Why? Because Ukraine, on one side, as we saw earlier, directly attacked the soldiers of the Russian Federation with kamikaze drones, and on the other side, this has been stated multiple times over the recent months, particularly when there is extremely effective drone control over this entire area, which allows for the prevention of Russian forces advancing to the very front lines with their heavy armored vehicles. Consequently, they are also unable to advance in any further mechanized manner against the Ukrainian army, at least in that particular location. However, the success in Pokrovsk, to be completely honest, comes at the cost of other sections of the front line. In Pokrovsk, the Ukrainian army uses its special forces extensively and is quite successful in halting the Russians. We're shifting our gaze southwest to Velyka Novosilka, where we observe that the Russian army has made quite notable advancements over the course of the last 2 weeks. We don't have new video material here, but we do have confirmed maps that show us that after Velyka Novosilka was captured about a month ago, we now have the situation that this entire area you see here, which is about 30 square kilometers, was captured in the last 2 weeks. This indicates that we can observe a somewhat hindered Russian advance moving progressively in the northwestern direction. And that's obviously a big problem for the Ukrainian army, because when we look at the overall map of the east of the country, we see that in the end, all fronts somehow have to be held. You can't say we're very successful in one area, because then there's an encirclement, a flanking in other areas. And that would indeed be very problematic. As you can quite clearly see in Pokrovsk, Ukraine continues to hold its ground effectively there. However, what we just saw, how Velyka Novosilka was positioned here, from there the Russians are trying to push further north. And if you were to cut the E50, which we just saw from there, then defending Pokrovsk much further to the east would no longer be possible at all. We move a bit further north to the Kupiansk region. There, too, a very interesting and partially very dangerous situation for Ukraine is developing. On one hand, significant Russian army attacks are underway here, which are effectively being held back. Here we see once again 5 Russian tanks and infantry fighting vehicles attacking the Kupiansk region, and we can see that the Ukrainians are very successful here. Among others, you can see the Achilles battalion up there on the right. Nonetheless, in cooperation with 2 other military units, successfully renders the Russian attack completely ineffective once again using those kamikaze drones. We see that all 5 vehicles are destroyed by the Ukrainian army throughout the video, once again showing that 100% of the Russian mechanized advance is thwarted here. However, it is just a snapshot and also quite limited in its scope. We'll see that on the street shortly, while here another BTR-80 is destroyed by the Ukrainian army and again likely followed up the next day to ensure that it can't be recovered anymore. As mentioned, the whole thing is a locally contained, successful situation, because when we look at the map of Kupiansk, we see that unfortunately we've had a division, so to speak, for several weeks now. On one side, there's the part on the east bank of the Oskil, notably harder to defend adequately. We remember the Oskil is this river that runs here, so we have this very difficult to defend area on this side. Since the Russians have it surrounded on 3 sides, the Ukrainians must move everything over the river. In that area, the Ukrainians achieved great success, managing to wipe out nearly all Russian tank incursions. On the other hand, we also have, as I'll continue drawing in the Oskil, the very, very, very dramatic situation where the Russians have advanced slightly north of Kupiansk, that they have crossed the Oskil and have now brought at least 3 settlements, some sources even speak of 5 settlements, under their control. And of course, it's the same here. The more places on the west bank of the eastern Spit fall under Russian control, the harder it becomes to get the Russians out, and the easier it would become for the Russians. It's evident that they are deliberately pushing south to cut off Kupiansk from its vital and essential supplies. And consequently, this entire pocket held here on the east bank would then be extremely at risk if that happens. It's quite a tough situation for Ukraine. Successful on one side, yet the Russian army keeps making those small but significant gains. We've mentioned the reason several times before. It's simply that the Ukrainian army units are spread very thin, and these absolute experts, who are also very well armed and very knowledgeable, are just scarce. What they have and strategically deploy them to the critical hotspots, for instance here at Petropavlivka on one side, but up there they are more often the units strategically stationed in the hinterland, who perhaps weren't fully equipped to handle such a large Russian advance, and therefore it's extremely challenging for Ukraine at this moment to maintain this balance, having to defend both here and further to the north. And when we discuss hotspots, we can also take another look into Donetsk, specifically within the Donetsk region. There is the city of Torezk. A large city that used to have 30,000 inhabitants, which fell completely under Russian control about 4 weeks ago. There are definitely some very interesting developments here that we can take a closer look at. On one hand, Torezk has consistently demonstrated itself to be a well-laid trap for the Russian army. We can see that even though the footage is a bit pixelated here, we see that many of the Russian soldiers who are in Torezk, who have tried to gain a foothold there, who tried to set up camps or logistics points there, that they are being attacked by the Ukrainians, and these are basically non-stop attacks. Around Torezk, very capable Ukrainian units are stationed, who are making life hell for the occupiers within the already lost city, fully disrupting their settling ability. And on the other hand, due to these attacks that we are witnessing here, and because of the very capable and strong Ukrainian units surrounding the city, we find ourselves in a very peculiar situation, namely that we can't say Torezk is fully under Russian control anymore. We'll take a look at the map for this, and this time we need to pay close attention to the colors we see. We see that the unmarked area is held by Ukraine in this case, the red area is securely held by Russia, and the orange area is contested. And just a few days ago, about a week ago, we had the situation where the entire city area, which we see marked a bit dark gray, could you perhaps follow up on that, since it's covering the entire city area of Torezk? While the entire city area was completely dark red just a few days ago, we now see this orange hue again, and we have evidence for it because these are newly geolocated images. That the Ukrainian army, for instance, has advanced back into the city center from the northwest, but also from the northeast, and that there are heavy fights with the Russian invaders. That means the Ukrainians still don't want to give up this city, even though they've actually already lost it completely, but that's also a new development. We didn't see anything like that last year, neither in Avdiivka or at Selidov or Kurakov, that the Ukrainians came back, that they continued to fight for the cities, and that the Russians were not able to advance quickly afterwards and leave the cities behind them. This is also a situation here, as we saw earlier, with the horses and donkeys that the Russians are now using. The Russian army, not just the Ukrainian army, is deeply concerned, facing major logistical issues regarding vehicles, as well as a shortage of personnel. And accordingly, we observe that Ukraine is partly managing to accomplish success in aspects that the Russian have not yet managed to achieve. We would like to move a bit further north, specifically to the western part of Russia, in the Kursk region. And we observe here the anticipated scenario, which has been expected for months now, of the slow and steady progress of the Russian army moving forward, namely forward in their own country towards the border with Ukraine and the Sumy region. And we have new footage showing that another very, very small village, Pokrovsk, has been recaptured by the Russian army. These recordings are actually a bit cynical, almost laughable in more than one way, because on the one hand, we see the Russians celebrating over a tiny village of about 15 houses, what they've recaptured, and they're not celebrating just anywhere but at the village school, the biggest and strongest building which they had previously. You can see it quite well here, completely destroyed by their own bombs. That means the Russians are celebrating that after more than 6 months they managed to retake a 15-house village. By targeting the infrastructure in Russia, we can see it quite well here. This is the massive hit here in the middle of the school by having completely destroyed the infrastructure in your own country. We take a glance at the map and observe that Pokrovsk had already been fairly important for the Ukrainian army. But why I've already mentioned this? The whole thing is, of course, to be expected, is again, we are here in Russia. We have a situation that is tactically advantageous for the Russians purely from a geographical perspective, as they can attack from 3 directions and also have the opportunity. We can see up there, that's just 12 kilometers that stretch before us. So theoretically, from both sides, it could also be subjected to bombardment with drones, artillery, rockets, and so forth. That means the Ukrainian supply line is extremely endangered, and nevertheless, Ukraine has been holding this small area for over 6 months. Pokrovsk, we can observe it displayed up here. I hope it's quite clear and easy to see. Now firmly back under Russian control once more. And the Russians are truly trying everything they can to reclaim Kursk. And it's naturally just a matter of time, especially since you're operating on your own familiar ground and have these significant tactical advantages. And we also look at the recordings that show us how much the Russians are trying to recapture everything on one side and with what technology they are doing it. On the other hand, it also highlights how complicated the situation is for the Ukrainian army, especially concerning their equipment with Western vehicles. Here we have a Russian drone guided via fiber optics. We can identify it due to the notably high quality. It's a kamikaze drone traveling along a road where Ukrainians attempted to advance, but unfortunately an entire line of their vehicles ended up being destroyed. The first is an XA-180. Of the Ukrainian army, and it's from Finland. That means a vehicle brought from Finland to Ukraine. The second vehicle is an International Max Pro, which comes from the USA and has also been made available to Ukraine. And then we see more and more vehicles joining. The next one is a T-64. From the Ukrainian army, still Soviet-made. That means an ancient vehicle, which is of course being used again in this war. And when this drone continues flying and looks at us, seeing how everything is cobbled together and logistically extremely difficult, we also see the problems Ukraine is suffering from. The next one we have here is a PBV-302 from Sweden, which means another country, another vehicle, all of which also need to be diligently maintained and kept operational by the Ukrainians, which is extremely difficult when we see it now. There are already 3 or 4 vehicles from 4 different countries. And now we will soon see the current targets of this drone. And as I mentioned before, on one hand, we see the Russians, who are using an extremely large number of fiber optic guided drones here. These are their top drones. We also see how impressive, we have to say brilliant, the image quality is, as well as the control by the Russian army operator. And we can now observe here that additional vehicles are joining. This is clearly a BMP-1 armored vehicle of the Ukrainian army. And now things become quite dramatic because we can see that there's still a Ukrainian soldier inside the vehicle. That means it's still an active vehicle, and Ukrainian soldiers are also involved here. A blessing in disguise for the Ukrainians, as the Russians are targeting the vehicles here. That's the main objective they're focusing on. We can now observe the drone as it maneuvers into position, and shortly we'll get another view where we can see the BMP-1 that has just been struck. Another vehicle has now arrived here, which was apparently brought in for evacuation, and the Ukrainian soldiers are now trying to get to safety in this direction. Here the Russians indeed hold the upper hand, as they can advance strategically from all directions with their kamikaze drones, which have a noteworthy range of up to 20 kilometers. Here's another PBV-302 that we see being attacked now by the Russian army. As mentioned, the Ukrainian soldiers are not the focus of the Russians here, but rather their vehicles, because they simply want to, well, you could say demobilize them. So they want to use those mechanical capabilities they have to quickly move from A to B to put an end to that in Kursk. And that when you look at the map, when you also see that Pokrovsk is now under Russian control, the Russians are succeeding very, very slowly, but they are steadily succeeding. Nevertheless, this great battle for Sucha, the last city and the only city that the Ukrainians ever occupied in Kursk, lies ahead for the Russians and the Ukrainians. We want to watch more drone videos from the Ukrainian army. They show that not only Ukraine is now reliant on Elon Musk's Starlink communication system, but furthermore, Russia's army is involved as well. At this time, we see here just how Ukraine is attacking a Russian-used Starlink systems. These are the small antennas visible here, specifically those square-shaped ones. I think you can capture it again in a moment and you'll see them relatively well. There we can observe that this particular antenna being set up here is immensely important for the Russian army, as they make it all possible, and indeed for both armies, not only communicating over traditional radio, which can easily be intercepted by the enemy, but also using platforms like WhatsApp, Signal, Threema, or Facebook, or any similar service. It certainly enables them to engage in communication with each other through encrypted internet-based communication programs. And that makes the situation and especially the communication significantly safer. And as it stands now, Starlink is blocked in Russia, meaning it's not accessible there, but it remains deployable in Ukraine. And for this reason, once the Russian soldiers cross the border into other areas, they prioritize quickly obtaining a Starlink system. This ensures they can communicate effectively through internet communication and connectivity options, crucial for their operational needs. And we can see here once more a very prominently positioned and noticeable Starlink antenna. That's also the question of why the Russians don't just place some bushes or rags or anything like that over it. Starlink always needs a connection to the sky. That means nothing should be built over it. However, small things don't bother there. And if you paint the whole thing green, for example, it would also be much harder to find. It is clear that the Russians aren't engaging in this. We can observe in detail how the white antennas are being attacked repeatedly. We can see the large number. I believe there's a counter running in the corner. If I'm not mistaken, it's a total of 16 antennas that the Ukrainians are attacking and destroying here. We see it. Sometimes the Russians hide them very well. Some specific units seem to have absolutely no fear whatsoever and didn't expect at all that the Ukrainians would take such decisive actions. And accordingly, they are also attacked. At the end, quite an impressive video again. Here you can see relatively well that the Russians specifically set up a ladder here. A rooftop, created an opening in this roof specifically to set up the Starlink antenna securely inside. The Ukrainians use this very cleverly, not only destroying the Starlink antenna, but probably also the Russian station hiding behind in this building. In the end, we want to look at recordings that I also find very impressive. They once again show a Ukrainian attack on an S-300 air defense system of the Russian army, but this time not from the perspective of the attack from above, but from the perspective of the drone that has already landed. And that is quite unique. You see here, I'll pause it briefly. As mentioned, one of the starter devices here on the left side, that's where the rockets actually come out. Here we see a part of the radar system and we see the Russians trying to extinguish down here. And we see the whole thing up close. Why are we doing this? The Ukrainians, in this case, attacked with a large drone. They released grenades or bombs from this drone onto the S-300 system, and afterward, they just landed the drone in the surrounding area during the night. That means they're just observing the extinguishing and rescue operations now, and can almost leisurely observe how the Russians are attempting to bring the situation back under control, which they are quite clearly struggling to achieve. We're about to see how Russian soldiers, just a few meters away, as we can see here, probably filmed with a zoom, nevertheless, we see they are armed soldiers, running a few meters ahead of the drone, but since it's pitch dark at night and the Ukrainians deployed this drone, which might be too big, like a small table, like a coffee table or something like that, which is why the Russians can't track them down, and we can see that they're overseeing the whole thing. In other words, we still have a very difficult situation, and this is very important and also contradicts the Russian and partially, one must also say, US-American propaganda in recent days was not only challenging for the Ukrainian, but also especially for the Russian army.